John Evans. New this half hour, a legal battle at the Battleship. A former assistant director at one of the area's most iconic landmarks is suing the Battleship North Carolina Commission, its executive director, and a state agency. WECT's Connor Smith spoke with Christopher Vargo, the man behind the lawsuit. So why is he doing this, Connor?
Well, John, Vargo alleges his former boss, Jay Martin, illegally listened to one of his conversations, ordered him to lie on timekeeping sheets, and then fired him for speaking out about all of it. Now, Vargo worked at the Battleship for 12 years. He was fired back in January. He says that was retaliation for expressing concerns about Martin. He's the historic ship's executive director. The 18-page suit was just filed yesterday. Among the allegations inside of it, Martin lied about overtime hours he wasn't working and broke state and federal law by recording a conversation between Vargo and a Battleship contractor. Vargo says this lawsuit is about getting transparency and accountability.
It's so important to have people with integrity, transparency, ethics, and who will follow the law in charge of it. And if that's not going to happen, then somebody needs to stand up and call it out. And that's what we're doing.
And we reached out to the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. John, a spokesperson, says they can't comment on active litigation.
All right, Connor, what did the Battleship folks, especially Martin, have to say when you contacted them about the suit?
Well, they didn't respond to several requests for comment we made today, John, but if we do hear back, we'll share their response inside this story on our website.
All right, Connor, appreciate the story tonight. Thanks.